Hello everybody, welcome back to Apple Gaming SE. This is news for December 24th through December 30th, 2023. So to close out the year, as always, we're going to talk about new subs, or rather, I have one new sub this week, which is totally okay. You can't see massive expansion every week. I still love you, I still appreciate you all, so thank you for getting me started on this journey. I actually didn't think I would get over 60 subs before the end of the year. I thought I might have 40, so to get to 62 is wonderful, and I appreciate you. Just the personal gratification I feel that there's so many people that are interested in Apple content around gaming is just it's just nice to know I'm not alone out there, so I really do. I just appreciate you all. And just to piggyback on that a bit, I have over 3,000 views on all of my videos at this point. I actually saw this last Sunday afternoon. I meant to say something sooner. I think I put a post up on Twitter about it, or X-Twitter, I forgot. That's what I'm calling it now, is X-Twitter. And man, it just, yeah. So we're not alone out there. We are interested in this platform, and we think it can succeed. So thank you all for just watching any and all of us Apple gamers out there. So thank you again. Anyway, on with the news. Getting into the news this week, since this is a gaming channel focused on Apple gaming and the Apple gaming ecosystem, we're going to talk about going inside Apple's massive push to transform the Mac into a gaming paradise. So this comes from Inverse.com. They did an in-depth interview with several Mac executives. And this isn't really like a new news story. Anybody who's been following this channel, at least, and other channels like MacGG or Mac Pro Tips or some Mac stuff, we're all Apple gamers. So, or gamers on the Apple platforms, I should say. So this is not really going to be a new news story to anybody who's kind of in that sphere. But this is interesting just to get the Apple to talk about what their ambitions are and what their goals are and their ideas are, without it being a 5 or 6 minute segment in a keynote somewhere. So the first thing I pulled out of this article is that Apple's attitude is more console-like when they compare making a game for whatever generation of Apple Silicon, so the consumer doesn't have to worry about whether or not the game is compatible with their hardware. So basically, a developer makes a game, and after working with Apple, they'll say, okay, if you have an M1 Mac, powered Mac or newer, this game is going to work for you, right? That's the minimum specification. Which is kind of like what they do with consoles, right? Like, you don't have to worry about your hardware configuration. If you've got a console and a game is made for that console, you know it's going to work. It's kind of the same thing with the Apple ecosystem, right? You have an iPhone 13 or newer, this game will run great. If you have an iPad M1 or newer, it'll run great. If you have a Mac M1 or newer, it'll run great. That kind of deal, right? So like on the Steam store, some games will say an Apple Silicon M1 powered Mac with at least 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is every single one of them. But just as an example, so at some point we might start seeing like 16 gigabytes as the minimum requirement, right? I don't think that's going to be probably for another year or two, because as long as Apple is going to support an 8 gigabyte like minimum spec device, so for example, there's been a lot of controversy around it, but like the 13-inch MacBook Pro with M3, it has 8 gigabytes of RAM. Apple's going to support that product for probably 5 years. So I think it's going to be a couple of years at least before we start seeing game developers requiring more than 8 gigabytes of RAM. One of the things that there's a gentleman in the interview named Doug Brooks. He's a Mac product marketing team member. And one of the things he said was, quote, "One thing we're excited about with the most recent launch of the M3 family of chips is that we're able to bring these powerful new technologies like dynamic caching, as well as ray tracing and mesh shading across our entire line of chips. We didn't start at the high end and trickle them down over time. We really wanted to bring that to as many customers as possible." To me, this feels like kind of feels like a swipe at NVIDIA and AMD for their graphics cards, and how they start out with something, they go super ultra high end, RTX 4090, 4080, that kind of thing. and then they pare back their cards over time, and you get a 4070 and a 4060 and a 4050 kind of deal, right? Like we saw that with the 3000 and the 2000 series, and they'll make those like in between cards. You know, you'll have a 2050 Ti that's not quite as good as a 2060 kind of deal. So I think what he's trying to say here is that wherever you're at on the M3 family, you've got access to all of these technologies. And so you've got a base set of hardware, and then from there it just goes up based on whether you've got an M3 Pro or an M3 Max, and presumably early next year we'll get the M3 Ultra. Now, I do think this is a statement that's a little suspicious with something like the 13-inch MacBook Pro. It's only got 8 gigabytes of RAM. I mean, otherwise it's a pretty believable statement, but the technology here, I'm not doubting the technology. What I mean is, despite all of these features, can a AAA game be an enjoyable experience with only 8 gigabytes of unified memory? We have seen a lot of tech channels do a lot of testing with 8 gigabytes of RAM, not really gaming too much, but, you know, with other workloads that are typical on the Mac, and we see that 8 gigabytes of RAM is not really all it's cracked up to be. So, that aside, I will give one advantage to Apple here over Windows, and to a lesser degree Linux, not having to fuss with drivers on a day one release, right? It seems like every AAA game on Windows has tons of driver issues for AMD, Intel, and NVIDIA. Linux games, typically the drivers come out a little bit later. It seems like the drivers are not as day one important, because there's just frankly very few dedicated Linux gamers, so it's a very small market. That's not a swipe at Linux gamers. I'm a Linux admin, like I love Linux. What I'm saying is that the hardware manufacturers of these graphics cards know their market is smaller, so they don't put in the resources, right, to target that kind of market, a very small segment of the market. Something else this article talks about, of course, is that Apple is continuing to bring tools to developers, like the Game Porting Toolkit, to make games more available to Mac customers regardless of the Unity engine or the Unreal Engine or any other kind of graphics engine. It seems, though, at least for the next couple years, Unity and Unreal are going to be the two big game engines to develop on, so it is obviously going to be a focus of Apple to make the Game Porting Toolkit work with those game engines a little more fluidly than perhaps others. Something else that stuck out in here is that Apple doesn't require universal purchases or cross progression, but I wonder if they should. I'm really not sure. And what I mean is that if I were making the decisions, I'd probably be torn about it. I don't want to force a developer to basically make a game, then put in the development time for another platform, even if it's the same ecosystem, but not see the financial benefit of that additional work. At the same time, from the customer perspective, you're very unlikely to buy a second copy of the same game, especially if you can't transfer saves between iOS and Mac. Again, if I were in charge, I might have to pull a Microsoft with the Xbox Series S and Series X. If you build a game for our platform, you've got to make it functional for both the reduced hardware console and the main hardware console. The visual experience of the two might be different, maybe even the controls due to the touchscreen nature of iOS will be different, but the content of the game isn't going to be different. Customers, gamers specifically, are only going to care if the game is playable on their platform. I think Inverse at the end, and this is the final point on this topic, at the end of this article gets it right. With the game industry projected to be worth nearly $390 billion by 2028, it's Apple's market to lose. So we're going to see Assassin's Creed Mirage next year. We're going to see Death Stranding next year. Apple also needs to be pushing for GTA 6, right? So if it follows the same course of development that the consoles did as for GTA 5, if GTA 6 follows that, you'll get a console release first, and then a year, 2 years, like a year and a half, 2 years later, you'll get the Windows version of the game. So Apple's going to need to push and say, hey, you need to bring it to our platform. If they could get it before Windows, they're definitely not going to get it before consoles. But if Apple could schmooze over Rockstar and get the game onto the Mac before Windows, that would be a huge win for them. So Apple needs to think about these things if they're going to attract a gaming audience and make this endeavor worth it. They're going to have to make it worth it. what I wonder from the outside looking in with Apple is, does Apple understand that something like the gaming ecosystem in the gamer market is something they need to chase, right? Like, it can't be a hobby for them. They've got to chase that market to drive it in their direction. There's other great hardware platforms out there. I mean, even like something like the Steam Deck is a great hardware platform that doesn't even have all of the same advantages that the Mac has. Same is true of the Xbox consoles and the PlayStation consoles. Mrs. Gaming and I, we both have not both of us, but we have a PlayStation 5 that we play games on. So there's great hardware out there already, and Apple's got to really put in an effort to make their hardware stand out. And it, like I said, it just can't be a hobby for them. It's really a market they're going to have to chase. And for the second story and the final story this year, we're going to talk about the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Apple Watch Ultra 2 returning to the Apple stores. There's a pause on the ban of those devices. So this comes from Apple Insider and MacRumors.com. So if you haven't been aware, the Apple Watch sales pause has been paused. I don't think Massimo and Apple are going to let this drag out forever. Massimo can obviously, maybe from one perspective, push this longer than Apple can. They aren't losing money on having manufactured hundreds or thousands or perhaps millions of devices. What I wonder is, though, is assuming Massimo and the ITC's response, that's the International Trade Commission, assuming their response to the U.S. Appeals Court is successful, is whether or not a higher U.S. court will force a settlement between Apple and Massimo. At some point, these products are so vital to the average populace that the courts might decide that these two need to get along. Think of the literal thousands of stories of life-saving interventions or vital sign warnings or just encouragement to get in a better routine that Apple Watches provide. I'll be keeping an eye on this one personally. It's going to be interesting, especially since the Massimo CEO already said he was open to a settlement with Apple. And I'm sure that settlement will cost Apple a pretty penny. Massimo has already invested $100 million into this lawsuit. I don't know the financial status of Massimo, but I wonder if the reason they've been speaking out about a settlement is that they can't afford to lose outright in court. So, like I said, from one perspective, Massimo aren't losing money having manufactured hundreds of thousands, millions of watches. At the same time, they are spending, they've already spent over $100 million on this lawsuit since 2020. So, at some point, Apple's got a lot more money than Massimo does in totality, but how much money are they willing to lose on this product segment? Some reports are saying that the Apple Watch line of devices is not a big moneymaker for Apple, and so these are kind of add-on devices that add a little padding to Apple's bottom line, but who knows? Those are rumors. Apple doesn't disclose that detail of their financial situation. So there are some other news stories from this week, but none were especially interesting. There's a lot of cool technologies coming to Apple platforms next year, but for the most part, it's things I've already covered, or the details are so sparse that it's not enough to have a conversation about. So with that being said, this is the final video of 2023. Thank you everybody for listening. I am looking forward to talking with you again in new streams as we continue on into 2024. I will be continuing Apple news and opinions into 2024. They're not super popular videos, but there's a few of you who like watching these videos, and it seems like the number of views and the view amount is pretty consistent week to week based on the YouTube metrics. So hopefully that continues to be the case. I found these topics interesting. I'm glad those of you who listen that you do as well. Thank you, everyone. Have yourselves a great New Year's Eve. And if you're listening to this after New Year's, Happy New Year's. Like and subscribe. And I look forward to talking with you in the year to come. Take care now. Bye-bye.